Hello there, seeker of silence. Come closer to the fire and let the night draw its chair beside you. The road has been long, and the hours have a way of settling heavier on the shoulders as the stars climb. If these quiet stories bring you peace, or help your thoughts loosen their grip after a weary day, feel free to subscribe so these tales of stone and memory may be shared again whenever the embers are kind. Now, let me begin. I am Gimli, son of Glóin, and though my beard has gathered the dust of many halls and the ash of many hearths, there are nights when the past walks back to me with the steady step of a miner returning home. Tonight, it is one such memory that stirs, a tale bound in iron and granite of a city that once rang with hammers and now listens only to itself. We called it Nargath-Dûm, a lesser-known sister to greater names, carved deep beneath a range of old mountains where the stone ran dark and fine. Its gates were never tall, but they were strong, set low and broad, as if the mountain itself had chosen to stoop rather than bar its children. I was young when I first walked those tunnels, my axe newly balanced, my pack heavy with tools, and my heart filled with the proud impatience of one eager to leave his mark upon the world. The journey there was no grand march. We traveled in small companies, following a trade road that wound between pines and broken ridges, stopping where the ground offered water and shelter. At dusk, lanterns were hung from spear hafts, their light trembling against the rock as the wind threaded its way through the passes. Older dwarves spoke little, but when they did, it was of seam lines and echoes, of how a mountain answers a hammer if one knows how to listen. Nargath-Dûm welcomed us with warmth drawn from deep forges and the smell of worked stone. Its halls curved rather than soared, each passage shaped by hands that favored endurance over display. I remember running my fingers along a newly cut wall, feeling the faint vibration of the mountain still settling around the work. There is a comfort in such places where every surface bears the memory of purpose. For many seasons, life there moved with steady rhythm. We rose to the sound of tools being gathered, ate beneath vaults darkened by time, and labored in chambers where the stone glittered faintly like a star caught and held. There were no songs at first, only the measured beat of craft, but even that became a kind of music when shared by many hands. It was during one such season that we found the old shaft. The maps marked it only with a faded line, a passage sealed generations before. Curiosity, as ever, pried at us more insistently than caution. A small team was chosen, myself among them, to clear the collapse and see what lay beyond. The work took days. Stone does not yield quickly when it has decided to rest. When at last the barrier fell away, a breath of colder air slipped through, carrying a scent unlike the living halls behind us. We raised our lamps and stepped into a gallery, untouched by recent hands. Carvings lined the walls, their edges worn smooth, depicting figures bent over anvils, faces stern and resolute. This had been an elder quarter, abandoned not by haste but by choice. We found no enemies there, no lurking shapes or sudden perils. Instead, we found stillness, thick with waiting. Tools lay where they had been set down, handles polished by use, blades dulled by time rather than neglect. In one chamber, a half-finished pillar stood wrapped in markings, a design paused mid-thought. It was then that the elders told us measuring was done for the day. We withdrew, sealing the shaft once more, not from fear but from respect. Some works are not meant to be finished by those who did not begin them. Yet that place stayed with me, as did the feeling that Nargath-Dûm held more stories than it had shared. Even as seasons turned and the city prospered, I would pass the sealed passage and feel the mountain's patience pressing gently against my thoughts. In time, that patience would be tested. But that is a tale that waits its turn, as all stone does. The seasons did not announce their passing in Nargath-Dûm with flowers or falling leaves. They revealed themselves in subtler ways, in the depth of the chill carried by the lower tunnels, in the tone of the stone when struck, in the way the mountain breathed through its vents. I learned to read those signs as one reads the lines of an old map, not quickly, but with growing trust. After the discovery of the Elder Gallery, our work took on a careful patience. The masters ordered surveys of nearby seams, not because we lacked ore, but because the mountain had begun to speak differently. It was not a warning, not yet, only a shift, like a pause in conversation before a heavier thought. I was assigned to a group tasked with reinforcing the western passages, older tunnels carved by hands long turned to dust. These corridors wound closer to the mountain spine, where stone grows dense and sound travels farther than expected. We worked by lantern light, placing braces, smoothing fractures, and listening. There is a moment when you rest your palm against a wall, when you feel whether it welcomes the touch or merely tolerates it. Those walls tolerated us. One evening, as the lamps were being lowered and tools wrapped, a sound passed through the tunnel. Not a crash nor a rumble, but a drawn-out sigh as if air had been released from a deep pocket far below. We stopped where we stood, each dwarf still, eyes meeting in the amber glow. "That came from beneath the old shaft," murmured Fundar, whose beard bore the silver rings of long service. No one answered at once, there was no need. The elders convened the following day, not in the great hall, but in a smaller chamber, lined with record stones. I was not meant to be there, yet Glóin, my father, brought me along, saying only that young ears sometimes hear what old ones have learned to overlook. Maps were unrolled across the stone table, their edges weighed down with chisels and seals. Lines were traced, measurements compared, and marks made where the stone had shifted over the years. All paths circled back to the sealed Elder Quarter. "We left it closed for a reason," one master said, his voice steady, not sharp. "And reasons change," another replied. "The mountain moves whether we watch or not." It was decided then that the shaft would be opened again, not for curiosity, but for understanding. If the deep places were stirring, it was better to meet that truth with open eyes. This time the descent was slower. We brought measuring rods, listening plates, and lamps designed to burn longer without tending. The air grew colder as we passed beyond the point where the Elder Gallery had first greeted us. The carvings watched us from the walls, their expressions unchanged. Dust lay thicker now, disturbed only by our steps. I noticed small fractures along the floor, hairline cracks that had not been there before, running toward the depths like threads drawn tight. We followed them. The passage narrowed, bending downward into a natural cavern where the worked stone gave way to raw rock. Here the mountain's heart showed itself plainly, layered and scarred by time. A pool of dark water lay still at the center, reflecting the lamps in broken fragments. As we circled the cavern, one of the listening plates began to hum, low and persistent. The sound vibrated through my boots, up into my legs, and settled there. "Something moves below," Fundar said. "Not a creature, not a host, stone." The realization brought neither fear nor excitement, only a deepening awareness that Nargath-Dûm stood upon a boundary older than our city. We marked the place and withdrew, sealing the passage again, but this time with runes of warning rather than respect. In the days that followed, changes came quietly. Tools left on benches shifted slightly overnight. Fine dust gathered where none had fallen before. The mountain was adjusting, and we were within its reach. Trade slowed as caravans were advised to wait. Families were asked to keep close to the inner halls. No alarm bells rang, yet everyone felt the tightening beneath the routines. I remember standing at the edge of the forge hall, watching sparks rise and fade, thinking how cities, like fires, must be tended or allowed to burn themselves out. Nargath-Dûm was still strong, but strength does not mean immobility. The elders prepared plans, not for battle, but for retreat, something few dwarves like to speak of. Routes were checked, stores counted, records sealed into stone vaults meant to outlast those who carved them. All the while the mountain breathed, and somewhere beneath us, the deep places continued their slow, patient movement, indifferent to pride, attentive only to time. There comes a point in every delving when the stone no longer answers as it once did, not with resistance nor with welcome, but with memory. That was how the mountain spoke to us then, not in threat, but in recollection. The elders ordered a full walk of the lower rings, a task that took many days and nights without clear measure of time. I walked with Glóin and two others, lanterns hooded low, our boots tracing paths worn smooth by generations before us. The walls bore the marks of different ages, chisel lines sharp in some places, softened elsewhere by the long patience of dust and breath. We passed through halls where the ceilings rose like frozen waves, stone shaped into arches that had held without complaint since before the names of kings were set in record. In those spaces, the air felt heavier, as if the mountain listened more closely. It was in the Hall of Measures that we first found the old inscription. The hall itself was narrow and long, used once to test the straightness of beams and the balance of stone-cut weights. Its floor was marked with lines and symbols, many faded, some renewed over time. At the far end, behind a rack of unused tools, lay a section of wall that had been covered, not sealed, but deliberately obscured. Glóin brushed away the dust with his sleeve. The markings beneath were older than the city above them, runes of warning, yes, but also of agreement. They knew, he said, tracing the symbols carefully. They knew this place would not remain still. The text spoke of a fault beneath the mountain, a slow-moving seam where stone pressed against stone, grinding not with violence but with inevitability. The early masters had mapped it, measured it, and chosen to build anyway, trusting that the mountain's patience would outlast their own. For many years it had. The record spoke of listening chambers placed deep along the fault, small hollows where sound and vibration could be read like weather. Most had collapsed or been sealed over time, but one location remained marked, a place called the Stonewake. We did not announce our intent to visit it. There are places best approached without ceremony. The path to the Stonewake descended through an abandoned stair, its edges worn down into a shallow slope. Lantern light revealed veins of metal glinting faintly in the walls, untouched, as if deliberately left behind. The air there carried a scent unlike the forges or living halls, sharp and mineral, reminding me of rain on bare rock. At the bottom, the passage opened into a chamber no larger than a gathering room, its walls smooth, not carved, but worn by contact. The floor sloped gently toward the center, where a single stone column rose, cracked along one side. We placed the listening plate against it. The vibration came almost at once, steady, deep, like a heartbeat felt through layers of earth. It was not fast, it was not urgent, but it was constant. This has been moving longer than our records, Fundar said, longer than our songs. Glóin nodded. And it will continue long after we are gone. The realization settled among us without argument. Cities are not immortal, no matter how well they are built. They endure only as long as the ground beneath them agrees. We marked the chamber carefully, renewing the runes not as wards, but as reminders. Then we returned, our steps slower, our voices fewer. Above, life continued in its familiar patterns. Meals were shared. Children learned their first measures of stone and metal, and the forges burned with steady heat. Yet beneath it all, a new awareness threaded through the city. The mountain had given warning not through collapse, but through persistence. That night, as I sat near the forge fires, I listened to the rhythm of hammer on anvil, and beneath it, imagined the deeper rhythm below, unseen, unfelt by most, yet always present. Somewhere in the elder depths, stone pressed upon stone, and Nargath-Dûm, proud and patient, rested upon that slow turning of the world, unaware that its greatest test would come not in sudden ruin, but in the long question of when to let go. The change did not arrive as disaster. It arrived as adjustment. Work crews were reassigned first quietly, their tasks altered without explanation. Certain shafts were closed for inspection, then reopened with new supports that bore no marks of ornament, the kind meant to hold, not to impress. I was sent to oversee a section of the eastern galleries where old living quarters had long since been abandoned. Stone beds lay carved into the walls, their edges worn smooth by bodies that had slept there centuries before. Dust lay thick enough to soften our steps, and the air moved little, as if uncertain whether it was still welcome. We worked by lantern and by memory. The younger dwarves asked questions and received answers that did not quite satisfy them. That is the way of such times. It was during one of these surveys that we found the hairline crack, not wide enough to catch a blade, not long enough to suggest danger, but new. I pressed my palm against it and felt nothing at first. Then, after a long moment, a faint vibration, more imagined than real. "This is close to the seam," I said. The others nodded, expressions unreadable in the low light. No one argued. The elders convened again, this time in the lesser council hall, away from the ceremonial stone and carved banners. Maps were laid out, not of glory or expansion, but of retreat paths and sealing points. I stood at the back, listening. "The Stonewake has shifted," one of the listeners reported. "Not faster. Just closer." There are few words in Khuzd-dûm for such a thing. We speak of collapse, of break, of fire and flood. But closeness, without immediacy, sits uneasily in the tongue. The decision came slowly, shaped by long debate and longer pauses. Certain halls would be closed, archives would be copied and moved upward. Relics not bound to the stone itself would be relocated, and one city, deep and old, would begin the long process of unmaking itself. Not abandoning, not fleeing, releasing. The work began at once, though it would take years to complete. Families were moved first, their belongings carried upward along the great ramps that had once served ore carts. Children asked why their rooms changed. Parents answered with stories of higher halls and brighter fires. The forges were next. Some could not be moved, their foundations fused with the mountain itself. Those were allowed to cool, their last embers banked carefully, as if for rest rather than extinction. I walked the deeper halls often during this time, committing them to memory. There were chambers where the walls bore murals carved directly into the stone, telling stories no one remembered telling. There were cisterns fed by ancient springs, their water still clear, still cold. In the Hall of Pillars I paused beneath a column carved in the likeness of a mountain goat, its horns spiraling upward. The sculptor's hand had been steady, confident. "What becomes of you?" I asked it quietly. Stone does not answer such questions. It endures them. One evening, as the shift bells echoed faintly through the upper levels, I heard a sound I had not heard before. A long, low groan, not sharp, not sudden. The mountain adjusting itself. Dust fell from the ceiling in a thin veil, catching the lantern light like slow snow. Nothing broke. Nothing fell. But the sound lingered in my chest long after it faded from the air. That night I dreamed of halls filling not with rubble but with shadow, stone gently leaning into itself, passages narrowing as if the mountain were drawing a breath it had held too long. When I woke, the decision no longer felt like loss. It felt like timing. There are battles won by holding ground and others by knowing when the ground itself wishes to move on. and Nargath-Dûm, city of craft and patience, had begun to listen. The sealing of a hall is not done with haste. Stone remembers how it is treated and responds in its own time. We began with the eastern approaches, where the corridors narrowed and the ceiling dipped low enough to brush a helm. Teams worked in silence, broken only by measured strikes of hammer and chisel. The sound traveling ahead of us and returning changed, as if the mountain were listening from several places at once. I oversaw the setting of the first gate. It was not a door meant to be opened again, but a face of stone shaped to resemble one. A courtesy, some said. A habit, I thought. Runes were carved along its edges, not for strength, but for memory. Names of masons long gone, dates marked by shifts of the Stonewake, a record of why the passage ended here and not elsewhere. When the final block was set, we stood back and regarded our work. The corridor beyond lay in shadow, its floor already gathering dust that no foot would disturb again. "Do you hear that?" asked Dinah, one of the younger smiths. I listened. There was no sound. "That's how it should be," I replied. As the weeks passed, similar closures followed. Each one carried its own weight. Some halls went easily, as if relieved. Others resisted, seams cracking slightly, dust falling in protest. In one such chamber, we found something unexpected. A small forge set into a niche behind a collapsed wall, its tools arranged neatly, its anvil polished by use. The firebox held no ash, only a smooth bed of stone, worn concave by countless heatings. "It wasn't on any map," Dinah said. "No," I agreed. "And yet it was used." We examined the markings on the wall, faint scratches forming patterns too informal to be ceremonial. Tallies, perhaps, or lessons practiced by a lone hand. The forge had been abandoned deliberately, tools cleaned, stone swept. "Who worked here?" Dinah asked. "Someone who knew when to stop," I said. We left the forge as it was, sealing the chamber beyond it, but leaving a narrow vent to the upper galleries, not for air, for respect. Above us, life continued to rearrange itself. New quarters were carved higher in the mountain, closer to the light shafts that had once seemed unnecessary. Gardens were replanted beneath crystal lenses to catch what daylight they could. The sound of hammers returned, steadier now, less driven. I found myself assigned to escort a small caravan outward, carrying relics meant to be entrusted to kin beyond the mountain. Axes with names etched into their hafts, ledgers bound in metal plates, a single crown, heavy enough to demand both hands. The road beyond the gates felt strange beneath my boots. Open air carries too many scents at once, and the sky presses down in a way stone never does. We traveled slowly, not from caution, but from habit. Along the way, we passed the ruins of older outposts, places where dwarves had once thought the mountain would allow more than it did. At one such ruin, half buried by scree and moss, I paused. The stones there were rough, unfinished, a place abandoned in urgency, not wisdom. "This is what happens when you stay too long," I said to no one in particular. Dinah nodded, eyes tracing the broken walls. When we returned to Nargath-Dûm, the lower bells had ceased ringing altogether. The sound of them still lived in memory, but not in air. The elders gathered us one final time in the deep council hall, not to announce a catastrophe, but to mark a passage. "The city will remain," said Thrain the listener, "but not in the way it has." Those words settled heavily and then gradually found their place. I was tasked with one last journey into the sealed reaches to ensure the runes had held and the stone had accepted its new shape. I went alone. Lantern light reached only so far, and beyond it the corridors curved away into darkness that felt older than absence. I walked slowly, counting steps, touching walls where my father had once walked. where his father had done the same. At the final gate, I placed my hand upon the stone. There was no vibration now, no tremor, only steadiness. I nodded once, as one does to a craftsman whose work is complete, and turned back. Behind me, the mountain did not follow. It did not need to. Some cities are lost to fire or blade. Others are surrendered piece by piece to time and wisdom, and the stone, when treated with care, remembers both. The upper halls felt unfamiliar at first, though they were shaped by our own hands. Stone newly cut has a different patience to it. It listens more than it speaks and waits to learn what kind of life will pass through it. I returned from the sealed reaches to find the city altered in subtle ways, not quieter, but steadier. The sharp urgency that once drove every strike of the hammer had softened into something more deliberate. Workshops had shifted upward, closer to the great vents, where air moved more freely. The clang of metal still rang through the passages, but it no longer chased itself down endless corridors. It stayed where it was made. I took up my tools again, not at the forges of war or gate-making, but in a smaller hall reserved for repair and remembrance. Here we restored items brought up from the lower city before it was sealed. A helm with a cracked rim, a shield worn thin at the edges, an axe whose blade had dulled not from battle, but from years of careful maintenance. Dainor joined me there, quieter than usual. "I don't hear them anymore," he said after a time. "The deep sounds?" He nodded. "They're still there," I replied. "We're simply no longer standing where they choose to speak." We worked side by side, the rhythm of our labor finding its own pace. Between strikes, I told him of the forge we had found, the one hidden behind the collapsed wall. "A single worker," I said, "someone who chose solitude, but not secrecy." Dainor considered this. "Do you think they were exiled?" he asked. "No," I said. "Exile leaves marks. This was a choice." The thought stayed with me longer than I expected. In the weeks that followed, messengers arrived from beyond the mountain. Kin from other halls, envoys from surface settlements that had long traded with us, though few had ever walked our deeper streets. They brought news of shifting roads, of valleys settling after distant quakes, of creatures moving away from places that had grown too still. The world, it seemed, had noticed our decision. One evening, as I walked the upper galleries, I felt a familiar vibration beneath my feet. Not the restless thrum of the lower city, but something slower. I stopped and placed my palm against the wall. The stone was warm, not heated by forge or flame, but by presence. I followed the sensation to a chamber newly opened, its ceiling cut with care to allow a shaft of pale light from above. Within, several dwarves stood in a loose circle, listening. At the center lay a slab of raw rock, unshaped. "We thought it might become a gathering place," one of the elders said when he noticed me. "Not for counsel, for listening." I knelt beside the stone and closed my eyes. The mountain spoke then, not in words, but in pressure and memory. A sense of layers settling into new balance, of spaces closing without resentment. "It accepts," I said. The elder smiled, lines deepening around his eyes. "That is enough," he replied. "That night I dreamed not of battles or falling halls, but of corridors filling slowly with dust, each grain finding its place without force." In the morning, a task awaited me that I had both anticipated and avoided. The hammer of Narration, oldest of our ceremonial tools, was to be moved. It had rested for centuries in a chamber carved when the city was young, far below the levels now sealed. The hammer was not used for striking, but for marking beginnings. Its head bore no edge, only runes worn smooth by countless hands. To leave it behind would have been unthinkable. A small group descended with me along the last unsealed path that led downward. We walked carefully, Lanterns held low, boots finding familiar grooves. The chamber lay undisturbed. The hammer rested upon its stone stand, unchanged. I lifted it with both hands. The weight was familiar, though heavier than I remembered, not from metal but from meaning. As we turned back, the mountain shifted slightly, a minor adjustment, like a breath taken and released. No alarm followed. We carried the hammer upward step by step until the air lightened and the echoes shortened. In its new resting place near the listening chamber, we set it upon a freshly cut stand. The runes caught the pale light and held it. "It belongs here now," Dinah said. "Yes," I agreed, "where hands still pass." As seasons turned, snow fell thick upon the upper slopes, unseen from our halls, but felt in the cooling air that drifted down the vents. We adjusted our fires, rebalanced stores. Life continued, reshaped but unbroken, and in the spaces left behind, sealed with care and memory, the stone kept its watch, holding stories that no longer needed telling aloud. Time moves differently once the deep halls are no longer measured by footsteps. Days were still counted, of course, marked by the turning of lamps and the sharing of meals, but the sense of descent that had once shaped our lives had softened into something broader. I found myself walking the upper levels more often, tracing paths that curved gently instead of plunging downward. The stone here carried fewer echoes. Sound did not chase itself into distance, but lingered briefly, then settled. It was during one of these walks that I was asked to guide a small delegation from the surface. They arrived at the high gate just after dawn, their breath visible in the cold air, cloaks dusted with frost. Men and women both, sturdy but uncertain, unused to ceilings that did not open into sky. I greeted them in the old way, palm to chest, head inclined. "Welcome," I said. "You stand in a hall that remembers being mountain." They smiled at that, unsure whether it was jest. As we walked, they asked careful questions, not of wealth or weapons, but of stone. "How do you know when a hall is finished?" one asked. "When it stops asking for more," I replied. They considered this quietly. I led them to the listening chamber, where the raw slab still lay at the center. The air there always felt slightly warmer, as if the stone held a memory of hands. One of the visitors knelt, pressing her fingertips to the rock. "It feels settled," she said. "Yes," I answered. "It has agreed to be here." When they departed later that day, their eyes lingered not on the grand arches or carved doors, but on the places where stone remained unshaped. They carried that with them, I think. Afterward, I returned to my work in the repair hall. The objects we restored grew fewer as time passed. There is only so much the past asks to be mended before it prefers to rest. One evening, Dinah brought me a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "This was found during the last sealing," he said. Inside lay a set of chisels, their handles worn to fit a hand smaller than mine. The metal bore no maker's mark. "They were left on a bench," he continued, "as if the owner meant to return." I turned them over carefully. "Perhaps they did," I said, "just not in the way we expected." We placed the chisels in the Hall of Tools, among items whose stories had outlasted their names. Later, as the city prepared for the final sealing of the eastern reaches, I was asked to walk the boundary one last time. The passage narrowed gradually, its walls reinforced with stone blocks, fitted so precisely that the seams all but vanished. Runes of closure had been carved along the arch, not warnings but acknowledgments. I stopped where the light from the upper halls thinned. Beyond lay darkness, deep and complete. I did not feel fear there, only familiarity. "This is not an ending," I said aloud, though no one stood beside me. "It is a keeping." The last stone was set without ceremony. No hammer struck it into place. It slid home under careful pressure, guided by hands that knew when to stop. When the seals were complete, the city felt lighter, not diminished but relieved of a weight it had carried out of habit rather than need. That night, as I sat near the great hearth, listening to the low murmur of conversation and the occasional crack of settling wood, I told a younger dwarf the story of the lost forge. "Did anyone ever find out who worked there?" he asked. "No," I replied, "but perhaps that was the point." He nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further. In the days that followed, the mountain grew quieter in its own way. Not absent, not withdrawn, simply at ease. And in that easing, I understood something I had not before. Stone does not mourn what is sealed with care. It remembers, and then it carries on. So did we. The city stood firm, reshaped by choice rather than collapse, its heart no longer pulled downward by habit alone. And in the halls where the hammer rang and the lanterns glowed, the stories continued, not louder, not grander, but steady, like the mountain itself, content to hold what mattered and release the rest. The first winter after the sealing arrived without warning. Snow fell heavily above us, pressing its weight into the vents and narrowing the paths of air that fed the upper halls. We felt it not as cold, but as a slow tightening, a reminder that the mountain and the world beyond still spoke to one another. Fires were adjusted. Stone shutters were lowered where they had not been used in generations. Nothing urgent, just attentive. I spent much of that season walking the perimeter halls, checking supports, listening for tones that did not belong. Stone has a way of announcing discomfort long before it demands correction. One evening, as I paused near an overlook cut into the mountain's face, I saw torchlight winding its way along the outer path. A lone figure climbed carefully, stopping often, as though the mountain itself required negotiation. When the gate opened, I found a dwarf I had not seen in many years, Borin of the Grey Marches. His beard had thinned, and frost clung to it even inside the hall. He smiled when he saw me, a slow expression shaped by distance. "I thought I might find you nearer the surface these days," he said. "Only when the stone agrees," I replied. He carried little with him, a travel pack, a roll of parchment tied with cord. We shared a meal by the hearth, speaking first of small things, roads that had shifted, halls that had grown quiet. The way trade routes had begun to favor gentler slopes. Eventually he unrolled the parchment, maps, old ones. "These were found behind a collapsed shrine," he said. "Not of your sealed halls, but of something adjacent, a branch that never fully became a city." I studied the markings. The style was familiar, but hesitant, as if the hand that drew them had been unsure whether the place deserved permanence. "There are marks of habitation," I said. "Brief, careful." "Yes," Borin replied, "and signs they left deliberately." The thought settled between us. Not a retreat, not a collapse, a pause. In the days that followed, a small group assembled to explore the mapped passage, not to reopen what had been sealed, but to understand what had been set aside. We descended along a slanted corridor that curved away from the main halls, its walls rougher, less adorned. This was not a place meant for display. The air grew cooler, then steadied. At the end of the passage lay a chamber unlike the others. No pillars, no carved stone beds. Only workbenches, long worn smooth, and a series of low arches that led nowhere. "They stopped," Borin said. "Yes," I replied, "before the mountain asked them to." The walls bore faint etchings, not runes, but measurements, notes half completed, ideas that never hardened into tradition. It was not a place of failure, it was a place of restraint. We found no tools left behind, no relics waiting to be claimed, only absence shaped by choice. On the return journey, no one spoke. There was nothing to argue over. That night I brought the maps to the listening chamber and laid them beside the raw stone. The warmth there felt unchanged. I placed my hand on the slab and waited. The response was subtle, a sense of agreement. In the weeks that followed, we spoke of that unfinished place often, not as a site to reclaim, but as an example. "You can stop before being forced," Daenor said one evening. "Yes," I answered, "and still be complete." As winter deepened, the mountain adjusted again, not in sound, but in comfort. Drafts softened. Stone held heat more readily. I began to understand that sealing the deep halls had not been an ending, but an offering. A gesture of trust returned quietly. When the snow above finally thinned and meltwater traced new paths down the outer rock, the city stood ready, neither reaching downward nor upward in haste. Balanced, and in that balance, the stories we told began to change. Less about what we had taken from the mountain, more about what we had learned to leave untouched. Spring announced itself slowly in the mountain, not through blossoms or birdsong, but through water. At first it was only a faint sound, a patient tapping somewhere beyond the sealed stone. Then thin rivulets appeared along channels cut long ago for meltwater, tracing paths that remembered older seasons. We adjusted gutters and basins, guiding the flow where it wished to go rather than forcing it elsewhere. That had become our way. I spent those weeks teaching again. Not in the formal halls where lessons were once delivered with hammer and slate, but along the walkways beside the listening stone, near the half-finished carvings that had been left deliberately rough. The younger ones gathered without being summoned. They asked fewer questions than their elders once had. Instead, they watched. "How do you know when to stop cutting?" one asked, running a hand along a practice wall. "When the stone begins to answer back," I said. "Not with resistance, with shape." They tried. Some cut too far and learned how to mend. Others stopped early and learned patience. Both lessons held. One afternoon, Borin returned to the high gate, this time accompanied by two others from the grey marches. They brought news not of danger, but of imitation. "Other halls are sealing," he said, standing beside me as we watched meltwater vanish into channels we had opened weeks before. "Not in fear, in understanding." I nodded. "Stone teaches by example," I replied. He smiled at that. Together we walked the upper galleries, speaking of places that had chosen differently over the years, cities that chased depth until depth answered with fire, halls that climbed too high and forgot the weight beneath them. "Your people changed first," Borin said. "That matters. Only because the mountain was willing," I answered. That night the elders asked me to speak in the great hall, not to announce anything, just to tell a story. I stood near the hearth, the hammer of Narun resting nearby, untouched. Faces turned toward me, old and young alike. "I will not speak of battles," I began, "nor of victories." I told them instead of the unfinished branch hall, of the lone forge behind the collapse, of the chisels left behind on a bench. I spoke of the moment the mountain adjusted, not in anger but in relief. When I finished, no one applauded. They did not need to. The fire shifted. Someone added a log. Life continued. Later, as the hall emptied, Daenor remained. "You've changed," he said. "So has the stone," I replied. He considered this. "Will you go deeper again?" he asked. "Perhaps," I said, "but not to stay." The thought did not trouble me. In the days that followed, I began to feel a loosening within myself, similar to what I had sensed in the mountain, a release of old urgency, of the need to prove depth through distance. The city no longer pulled at me from below, it held me where I stood. When the last of the snowmelt passed and the vents breathed freely again, The listening chamber felt warmer than ever, not from heat, but from presence. I placed my palm on the raw stone one final time that season. It did not respond with pressure or memory, only steadiness, and that, I realized, was the answer. Stone does not demand that we stay. It only asks that we know when we are still welcome. As summer approached above us, unseen but felt in the gentler air, I began to prepare for a different kind of journey, not outward, but onward. The city would endure without my constant steps along its halls. Others had learned how to listen, and the mountain, patient as ever, had already agreed. There is a moment rarely marked when a place no longer asks for you each morning, not because it has grown cold or distant, but because it has learned what it needed to learn. I felt that moment arrive one evening as I walked the uppermost gallery alone. The lamps were low, their light resting easily against the stone. No draughts argued with the flames, no distant groans echoed from below. The city was at ease. I stopped beside an old balustrade, carved with the patterns of roots and veins, designs meant to remind us that stone too grows in its own fashion. Beyond it lay a drop into darkness, not sealed, not forbidden, simply untraveled. I did not feel drawn there. Instead, my gaze lifted, following the gentle slope of the passage that curved toward the higher gates, toward air that tasted faintly of pine and meltwater, toward a world that continued its own shaping. When I told the elders of my intention, they did not object. They had been expecting it, I think. "You are not leaving," one of them said. "You are extending." "Yes," I replied, "and carrying what was given." The hammer of Narun remained where it was. It did not belong to my hands alone. The listening stone, warm and patient, needed no farewell. On the morning of my departure, the city gathered not in the great hall, but along the ramp that led upward. No banners were raised, no oaths spoken. Hands touched shoulders, foreheads rested briefly together. Dinor walked with me to the gate. "You'll tell them," he said, "about stopping before the stone asks." "I will," I answered, "and about listening before striking." The gate opened slowly, sunlight spilling in pale and wide. Snow lingered in patches beyond, but it no longer felt heavy. I stepped out onto the mountain path and turned back once. The city did not loom behind me. It did not withdraw. It stood exactly as it was meant to. As I walked onward, the sound of hammer and forge faded, replaced by wind moving through stone and grass. The rhythm was different, but not unfamiliar. I thought of the unfinished halls, the sealed depths, the places left untouched by choice rather than loss, of stone that remembered not every strike but every pause. Somewhere beneath my feet, far below, the mountain adjusted itself again, not in warning, in comfort. And I understood at last that the greatest craft of my people was not in what we built, nor in what we reclaimed, but in what we learned to leave complete without our presence. The path curved gently ahead, disappearing around a shoulder of rock. I followed it without hurry. The mountain kept its stories, the city kept its shape, and I carried with me the knowledge that stone, when treated with patience, never truly closes. It simply waits, steady and enduring, for the next hand that knows how to listen.